This
But
conference will now be recorded.
hey everybody. So we just published this. I'm going to hold it up so I get maximum coverage. And just to talk to you a little bit about the Genesis, the last time I came on the Genesis events and talked about my book, I spent an enormous amount of time talking about the technical aspects of how the book was written to the point where Giannis had to interrupt me and tell me to talk about what was in the book. I did actually write this book the same way, so if that interested you, I did write it in Markdown and processed it into a PDF. This time, though, a little production note. I did both the paperback and the ebook at the same time, which I highly recommend because in order to teach a class, I had to go back to the first book and um, create an ebook out of a PDF, which was a disaster. So I did both at the same time this time, which was great. But this book, the genesis of this was two years ago in Detroit with Karen McGrain at we were consulting on CMS evaluations for a large financial customer, and Karen and I were in Detroit for 4 days, and we saw 4 vendors, I believe, in 4 days came through. So every vendor, and this is the second time I had done this with Karen, like just prior to that. In the January of that year, we had done like 5 vendors in 4 days in New York. And so when you see a bunch of vendor demos in a row, you start to notice patterns. You start to notice the same things over and over and over again, and the same things that the vendors do. And it's really weird asymmetry because the vendor comes in and from their perspective, they've only done the demo once. And by the 5th time, you're like, okay, well, I've seen this exact same demo 5 times because I wrote the scenarios. And so you kind of start to notice patterns. And literally by the 5th vendor, and they were a great vendor, it's nothing against them. I was like kind of bored. So I started just writing down some headings, and it was going to be a blog post on Gadgetopia, as most things in my life start. So I started kind of writing this blog post and writing some headings about like what I would talk about when it came to the CMS selection process. And as what happened with the last book, the blog post just got too long. I transferred it to a Google Doc, and I kept referring to it in Twitter as the mother of all blog posts. And it rolled out to about 13,000 words eventually. And the longest blog post otherwise I've ever done, I guess, took is about 6,000 words. So it was always twice that. It was way too long to be a blog post. And frankly, I didn't really know what to do with it, so it just kind of sat around. I had showed it to some people, and everybody who read it was like, "Yeah, that totally is valid and correct perspective on how these things play out." And so it just sat around for a while. And then when I joined Episerver, I showed it to someone and said, I have this like 15,000 words of content sitting around. Is there something we would do with this? And then the marketing lead gen just jumped on it and said, yeah, let's publish that. So it took about 2 more months to get the book into shape. I think it ended up being 25,000 words. But what it is it's entitled Things You Should Know, 25 Lessons I've Learned About Selecting Content, Technology, and Services. Sam Otis is the designer of Blend who designed the cover. Episerver hired Blend to do the creative work on it. And the motif is there's a little bird there. And it's like things a little bird told me. I'll just kind of go over some of the lessons just to give you an idea of what it is. But you know, first of all, I discussed the roster of players, like in a CMS selection, who you're going to find. Like the big 3 would be the vendor, the integrator, and the customer. And then there are other things. You might have a selection consultant, you have a marketing agency. But, you know, I talk about how internal IT can be territorial, about how some people demand that you estimate ROI on a content project, which is very hard to do. I talk about the difference between estimating ROI on commerce as opposed to estimating ROI on content. Commerce is much closer to the money. It's much easier to identify a conversion and how much that conversion was worth to you on a commerce project because you've like priced all your products. Whereas a content project, it's very hard. I talk about the fact that most organizations can't get out of their own way. They have no governance strategy, and really a large part of their problems are the fact that just nobody's talking to each other and they have no governance. I talk about how confusing it can be between software and services, how people think they're just going to get one clean RFP, and often they don't. They get an RFP for software and they get an RFP for services, and they might get an RFP for cloud hosting, and that confuses some people. I talk about how important it is for a vendor ecosystem, how you need to evaluate vendors. I talk about a project I had. It was that Detroit project. That was the start of this book, where we put them in a smaller vendor CMS, and it didn't end well for them. They went with a smaller vendor that we picked for a very specific reason, but they overwhelmed their professional services group, and it turned out the vendor had no partner ecosystem. There were literally like 12 people in the country that knew how to work the system. and it didn't end well for them, and they're trying to get out of that CMS now. And I talk about just there's a little bit of integrator centrism in the sense that I talk about some of the experience that we've had with customers and how customers try to start a relationship in an adversarial sense. I think all of us can relate to getting RFPs that are punitive and just like the tone is awful, and how people try to lawyer up and they try to put these ironclad contracts in place, and they don't understand that people are going to compensate for risk. And if you're going to charge me $1,000 for every day your project's going to be late, I'm going to mark up the project to account by that. And I talk about how people don't want to share their budget number, and they probably just should. Much more productive if somebody comes to an integrator and says, I have $100,000, what can we do with that? Rather than saying, here's my like a vague list of 20 bullet points, how much is this going to cost me? So I talk about these 25 lessons, and honestly, it's really 25 blog posts, really. Each one is maybe 1,000 words, 1,500 words. You can probably read each chapter in about 3 or 4 minutes. And then at the end, I mean, what Giannis was talking about is I would really like to do another one of these. I have a little bit at the end that the thing that Giannis was pointing at was a subject title, Are There More Things You Should Know? And basically what I'm doing is inviting people to get in touch with me and tell me things that they thought should be in the book that weren't. And I would love to do a second edition that's maybe 50 lessons, or I don't know, 40 lessons or 30 lessons or whatever. So I'm really happy with the book. It was my 3rd book, and then I don't know if people saw on Twitter, but Episerver surprised me on an all hands call. They used Cameo, which is a service where you can hire celebrities to do like shout outs, and they got Jim O'Heir to shoot. He played Jerry on Parks and Rec, which I just finished binging and just fell in love with and wouldn't shut up about, as is most things I get excited about. I talk about them nonstop. They got him to shoot a little video book review, and like the shout outs are supposed to be like 30 seconds, but he did it in character as Jerry from Parks and Rec, and he went on for like 2 minutes, and he just nailed it. Like the guy should get an Emmy for like the acting range that he did in those 2 minutes, and it was just lovely. And they actually did a second one. I have loved Friends my entire life, so they actually hired Jane Sibette, who played Carol in Friends, and they had her do one that was very sweet. But you didn't do it in character because like Carol isn't really a notable enough character that you could really do it in character. And it was very sweet, but they didn't think that would have the impact. So then they did the Parks and Rec one, which was amazing. So anyway, that's the story of the book and how it got published, and it's available in both paperback and ebook. And I hope you get a chance to read it.
There you go. So whether the rest of you know all the 25 lessons or not, why don't we just take some time to Q&A things you should know, and then I'm sure Deane can quickly say, okay, that's number 5, I have that. That's number 3, I have that. Things you should know.
Somebody will post something on Twitter, and I'll put related : in a blog post from Gadgetopia. I see Jeff laughing. Yeah, I see you.
That's
Graham.
a good. That's a good habit.
So actually, I at one point I want to say I bought the domain related:com, and we were going to do some kind of joke there where search my Twitter feed for whenever I had the word related and a colon. But thankfully cooler heads prevailed, and I just wrote a book instead.
All right. So what's the things you should know? I don't want to pick on you, Laura, all the time, but anybody, what's the things you should know when you select content, technology, and services? What comes to mind?
Well, I haven't read the book, Deane, but I have probably have similar perspectives. One of the
I stopped listening after you said I haven't read the book.
One of the I only read autographed editions, and I haven't an autographed edition show up at my house yet. But one of the things I advocate for, and very few organizations pick us up on this, is usually references are at the back of the process, and they're really just used as like a risk mitigation check. Like, are we hiring someone that at least has worked with someone that will say nice things about them? And we've advocate for like using the selection process to pull the idea of references up earlier into the project. So, and use the references more strategically to really gain insight into what's kind of worked well and what hasn't, not just with the relationships with the providers, but with their own like organizations, because chances are vendors are offering up folks that have been through very similar journeys. And so just doing a lot more fact finding on the references themselves to kind of guide you in your process to be successful.
Okay, so that could easily be number 26 in the sense. I didn't
Oh,
really
there we
cover-
go.
There you go. We didn't really cover references in the book, but it's funny, Jeff, that you mentioned that because I wrote the Selecting CMS chapter for the Web Project Guide, and I talked about references then. I'm very skeptical about references, and Jeff, I very much want to hear your perspective on this, but when you ask somebody for references, first of all, you're not going to get any bad references. You're just not. I mean, they're going to cherry pick references. Not only that, they're probably going to send you references that have done reference calls with them before and may be compensated for that. And I'm not saying out and out bribery, but at Blend Interactive, we had a couple clients that would do a lot of reference calls before us, and we would like send them $250 gift cards to Starbucks just to say thank you for taking the time, because they would put a lot of time into these reference calls. So I don't think you're going to get a bad reference. And honestly, I have heard of one instance of this happening, and I'm sure it happens more often, but I've heard of one instance where a customer was very unhappy with an integrator, and to the point where legal threats ensued. And part of the settlement is, okay, we will finish the work, but you will do 3 reference calls for us and say that we're great. So, I mean, ironically, you were getting like a terrible reference, that a horrible experience. But no, thank you for that, Jeff, because I could certainly make that number 26. What has been your experience with references? I mean, when someone would come to Connective DX, I don't know if PK has a different process. I think it's safe to say, and it's not at all pejorative, that you probably had a stable of go-to customers for references.
Yeah, we use the same 3 on every project we have for years. No, I think we, on the service side, we try not to disclose them too early, because a lot of thought goes into matching up people for references, and we'll wait to make sure that we're, so I kind of counter on my own recommendation on the client side, but we'll wait to make sure that we're a right fit, that we've got far enough along in the process. And we may divulge the orgs, but we won't actually link up the names, because you have to kind of burn a reference to put it in an RFP, because you have to pre-clear it with them, and that take, you know, most of the time they don't call, because you either don't get that far in the process or they just don't call references. But yeah, to your point, Deane, I mean, I think making references more strategic is on the end organization evaluating, and I think they just rush through a lot of formulaic questions and don't take the opportunity to get to the heart of the insight they could get from talking to another organization that's gone through a very similar project that they're about to go through. So it's really reframing the client's approach to references, and not just falling into the trap where it's a rubber stamp at the end of the project, at the end of the selection process.
Hey Jeff, this is Matt. Just to kind of reflect on that, I find that with public sector RFPs, and I'm not sure if you guys do more or less of those, but I find that with the public sector, it's sort of permeates every RFP as pro forma. So there's a requirement, and then there's typically a requirement of, you know, featuring references that meet very specific benchmarks. You know, they've worked with government for 10 years. They have these types of certifications or requirements. We have go-tos as well. I think I can echo that pretty strongly, that, you know, there are well-vetted public sector customers that we had for a long time that tend to fit that bill for almost every application. But I think when I read the RFPs, that they're peeled very much from the same fruit, that you know, someone went online, found an RFP, you know, which these are broadly accessible due to, you know, the access with public records. So they go find an RFP that somewhat fits their requirements, and they don't quite live in the same world or realm as RFPs for, say, you know, building an extension on a highway, right? You know, buying web services, digital services, or a CMS specifically, kind of draws a different type of methodology that gets customized into each of these RFPs. But at the same time, you can see echoes of other RFPs and the structure of it. And I think that pro forma of having those requirements baked into the RFP structure, I see that time and time again. It's tough to kind of settle that out. I do agree with you, though, that I think if more thought was put into you know, how, you know, broadly it's being used on the client's end, you know, how are we going to be assessing it, be more thoughtful and intentional about that. I think it could improve the quality of how we pair them up and how we match them. But I definitely hear what both you guys are saying in terms of, on the services side, how these things are gold. These relationships are gold for us. So we're very careful about, how we use them, but we do have some go-tos that are kind of in the quick Rolodex of just grabbing these three, and they work for us.
All right. Anybody else on references? Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Matt. That was number 26.
I got lesson number 26. Anybody got 27?
I think on our side, I think we
All
do
right.
see people checking the references sort of through like a G2 or Capterra a little bit more. I don't know if people have seen that kind of permeate, but we've definitely put a bit of effort in making sure that we can build out those profiles.
Cool. Any other things that comes to mind, Paul, now that you're unmuted, in terms of lessons you've learned about selecting content, technology, and services?
I think the amount of potential customers who use an RFP to be more of their functional spec, and that their request is not always as formed as it might be a snapshot of what they have right now, but it's not a snapshot of where they'd like to go, and sort of that transformation, what happens from their initial request into what they really think they want, and some of that is they're opening their minds around what type of technologies, and when they talk to different vendors and they become a little bit more up to date in technology, but we've definitely seen that sort of what an initial request comes in as is most of the time not what they tend to go out with.
So that's an interesting point. Okay, I did legitimately write that down as number 27, by the way. So, but it's an interesting point. Your statement there is that your RFP is not your functional spec, and I think maybe a particular angle on that is an RFP gets written in isolation, right? It gets written by the client, or maybe they might have a selection consultant, but a functional spec is written with expert consulting. I would hope that they would then engage with somebody who would help them write a functional specification with some kind of expertise in CMS. And do you think a functional spec should or is written with the context of the system in mind? I mean, do you write a functional spec for your project in Sitecore or in Episerver?
Well, I think, Deane, the sort of when customers come and they don't really have us, they just go, I need a CMS, and they don't really think about the features, is one sort of maybe point where they get just tripped up at the start, where they oversimplify. And I think, we're at a point where most platforms can do pretty much the same things. But the customer needs also to decide what parts of those things they're going to use, right? And maybe that's just a fluid part where they're thinking one thing and it just transforms, or they think it and they bring in marketing, or they think it and they bring in technology, or the business needs might change from what they originally thought. So trying to at least just to try and have it nailed down a little bit, I think, right? If you go like, we're going to have a website, that's great, but if you're going to have a website that's localized or not, and that can really, it can say, obviously all the software is supported, but if it's not really a consideration at an early stage, and they go, oh, by the way, we want to have a localizer, oh, by the way, we want it to be headless, or something that they just tack on that could really have a big implications. I think that maybe if they work with a consultant to get that a little bit more shored up at the start, I think that would definitely help them maybe tick the boxes faster and figure those out internally, right? I think maybe that's the internal power struggle inside an organization. Depends who leads it. Is it marketing? Is it tech? Is it executives? But I think that there might be quicker ways that you can get through that process to it and simplify it a little bit.
Yeah, and that's something I wanted to mention, is that a lot of organizations just say, they'll say something like localization, which sounds great, and they don't actually know what they mean by that. So there's a lot of analysis of those requirements that has to happen, that may need to happen internally or with a consultant. Not that I'm biased. To figure out really, granularly what it is they need, because that can impact their purchase decision and what tool is going to be right for them. You know, every company is going to say, we want localization, or we want personalization, or we want, you know, XYZ, but they don't understand why they want it, or, you know, whether they even need it, or what it should look like for them. And then they don't understand the level of work they'll have to put in. It's not just, we're going to buy a CMS, we'll click install, and we've got localization, right? They have to actually clean up their data and put more foundational stuff in place. And that all takes more investment of time and money that they're not always aware of. So it's a really good idea for them to do that soul searching ahead of time on, you know, not just what they think they want or need, but, you know, what can they really handle?
So Deane, how would you summarize this new one, number 27?
Anyone else not hearing Deane at all?
I'm not hearing him.
Sorry, it's very confusing. I have a microphone with a hardware mute button, so it has like a button that you press, and sometimes I'm muted on one. I have no consistency about how I mute myself. Sometimes I have no consistency if I mute myself. So sorry.
But now we hear you, Deane.
Yeah, no, this is super helpful and very interesting, Paul, and I appreciate that. Is that you know, an RFP and a functional spec are not the same thing, and there's probably a lot of discussion that we could make about how they get written and what goes into them. And Laura, very much appreciate your point about, like, a functional spec is the kind of rain on the parade, right? The RFP is the parade. Hey, here's all the great things we're gonna do. And the functional spec is the thunderstorm that rains on that parade. It says, okay, now, like, you have to think through them. I think so many ideas sound so good in theory, but then as you think through them, like, they just like don't pan out. How about this though? Something else I want to talk, just especially with the service providers in the room. Everybody talks about Agile methodology, right? Agile iterative methodology. What we found at Blend is that that's actually fairly hard to do as a professional services group, because you want to do Agile, but at the same time, your customers want a hard number. They want to know, like, it's going to cost this amount of money. And that's really hard to do when, you know, the Agile methodology is, you know, get started, do short iterations, keep yourself close to release. And then when you have a customer saying, that's all well and good, but I want to know to the penny how much this is going to cost me. So to the technical integrators in the room, Mark and Jeff, and I'm sure there are some others that I'm forgetting. Mind you, I just got a note that the organizer is having technical difficulties. So I think Giannis got kicked out of his own meeting. But can you guys tell me, how does Agile work inside your organizations? Can you do an Agile iterative method where you just tell the customer, hey, we're just going to kind of get started and iterate for a while and then be done? Is that work? Mark, you just went off mute.
Yeah, if they do what you've already specified they need to do, which is disclose a budget, then yes, what we do is prioritize their implementation efforts within that budget, knowing that at some point the list is going to be longer than the budget will allow. But if we address the higher priority items first, get those done in a way that is satisfactory, then we can negotiate where we stop the implementation customization efforts at the bottom of that list.
Okay, so
if you want some evidence,
to do a true
evidence
process, you think?
No, we don't do true Agile. We do iterative functional spec negotiation, I think is probably the flavor that we would use.
But you really have to have budget disclosure for that to work.
Yeah, we'll do it fixed price all day as long as the scope is flexible, and we've had good luck with that for 10 years. So it's usually pretty easy to achieve.
Okay, good to know.
And before Jeff goes, I was going to say, if you want some evidence that budget disclosure is a benefit, I did participate in an RFP at the beginning of the year where there was 12 respondents, and the price, this is a public sector RFP, so I got the results, but the price range for a 6-year implementation, migration, and licensing and hosting for 6 years, the prices range from $28,000 to $9 million.
I tell the story in the book about how somebody, I still remember this. In fact, some of you may have got this RFP, but it was a public school district in Montclair, New Jersey. You may have got this RFP years ago, but they refused to mention their budget. And I took an evaluation of it and I was like, I'm sorry, this is just, I'm not going to respond to this because you want so much and I don't think you have the money. And so I ended up not responding. And I remember I got a snippy little email response from them once when I declined. I basically sent them a very nice email. So look, I just can't respond. Maybe I'm confusing two RFPs, but there was one situation where I declined to respond to an RFP because they wouldn't reveal their budget and I didn't think they had enough money. And I responded and told them this, and they sent me a very snippy note saying that, oh, we had this amount of money, but now you don't want to bid, okay? And I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm glad that you don't have enough budget, but you screwed yourself out of a really good response by not telling me that. Like the only loser here is you, really. So I tell that story in the book that I just think it's so much more productive if you say how much money you have, because like $28,000 to $9 million. I mean, how many of those vendors just like could have been eliminated right off the bat? And another thing throughout the book that I mentioned a couple times, and just coming from the integrator side where I've been making sales, is don't waste people's time. Don't go fishing, and because the integrators on the phone and probably the vendors too can sympathize with the fact that responding to an RFP takes time, it takes effort, and I get really annoyed with people who just go fishing and then they get annoyed when you come back and say, look, you're talking about budget, I just can't respond to this unless I have some idea that we're in the same ballpark, and then they refuse to respond. It's like, I'm not going to entertain your fishing expedition because my time costs money and this costs effort. I talk about, related to this, I talk about like abusive RFPs. We've all got those ridiculous RFPs that like you read 3 pages into it and you already think, I never want to work for these people. Like the disdain just rolls off the page. It's like palpable. And I think everybody's had those RFPs and they're not productive at all. And I have RFPs I have just thrown away because I wouldn't want to work for the company that wrote it. So, okay, number 28 then, I'll talk about the relationship of Agile to professional services. This is super productive. I've already gotten through.
Well, I want to hear Jeff's answer to that question too.
Oh, for the Agile one? Yeah, we don't do Agile for the design and build. I mean, we have a whole Agile practice. We'll do Agile all day if you want to sign up for the actual Agile principles. But all of our clients, to Deane's point, that are entering these types of capital projects that have very specific outcomes they want to know that's going to come at a fixed price. So we fix bid the first part of it. It gets the requirements and design specification and all kind of the upfront work, and we'll still work in a very iterative way and fold in Agile principles and be very collaborative. When we do get to the build, that does run more sprint-based way, and we do have some clients that will sign up for a partnership on the build and run it pretty close to being Agile and just sign up for more sprints when we need more sprints. But I'd say that's the minority. Like very, very few companies that actually want to sign up for what Agile really means.
I think Agile works well if you have an internal development team with sunk costs, and that works really great. But at Blend, we tried very hard to make Agile work for professional services, and it can be a real tough sell because people love the idea of Agile. They don't love the budget vagueness that it brings with it.
Right. We do one client. It's more of a retained team model, though. We have one client that shifted to more product-based thinking, and they sign up for more of a retained team model, and they run their whole digital outfit based upon an Agile mindset. But we're basically just giving them a full-time team over a year, and that's we're running everything just Agile based. So that's not I wouldn't call that a CMS project. That's post-launch.
Yeah, I would
mention that the benefit of Agile. Laura mentioned earlier that a lot of clients think they know what they want, but they don't really. And so our kind of iterative functional spec approach allows us to essentially talk them out of dumb ideas after we've committed to a fixed price project. And we only are able to do that just because we average it out over time. We know we're not going to be able to win that argument every time, but most of the time they see reason and they will adjust along the way.
Yeah,
Also
I
add that,
I would echo the. Sorry, go ahead, Laura.
that a lot of companies, they, on the client side, it's another one of those, like, they think they want Agile because it's a great buzzword and it sounds cool, and they are not organizationally equipped to do that. They, their budget process requires a fixed amount, which is what you guys are talking about. And, and they need approvals from 3 levels up, and this person's on vacation and can't make a scrum and can't, so there's a lot of work involved with running an Agile project that they just cannot handle. And I have seen success with sort of vaguely Agile iterative thing. And my upcoming webinar, I'll kind of get into that a little bit, but real Agile, most larger companies, they just can't do it. They're not set up for it.
Yeah, these are real. We get a lot of requests for Agile development, and we don't do it at all for the initial stages of the project. We want that foundation to be properly planned out and built before we start layering on top. Once you get into additional features, it's a completely different story, and that's been much more successful, but never for the foundation.
So did we agree on a 28? I'm kind of just roughly trying to keep notes. Deane, did you have a 28?
I'm taking 28 as to be that Agile and external professional services can sometimes be hard to reconcile. I guess I'll put a better title on it later, but I'm going to call that number 28. So.
Cool. And we have the related.
Write the second edition here on this phone call. We have 3 more minutes to get 22 more lessons. Let's go.
I think we're a little bit flexible on time, but anything else comes to mind for anybody else on the call? I have one comment. I can jump in. So thank you, Deane, for the book, the 3rd book. And what I thought was really positive in going through all the lessons learned, as you can briefly see here, and much easier, of course, browse online as well in the table of contents, is that they are all, as far as I read them, very content, technology, and services related, where I find that a lot of this that's written in this industry is something that you could say this goes for all kinds of projects as well. And I think you didn't fall in that trap. But there's one exception perhaps, and that's lesson 14. If you don't know how to write an RFP, get help. I would say that probably goes for, if you don't know how to procure something, get help.
Yeah, so the book, clearly, my background in CMS, and CMS is like all I'm interested in, but I'm like in the middle of writing this book. Appiserver made an acquisition like last year. They acquired, Appiserver also has a commerce practice, but they acquired another B2B commerce company, and they acquired Insight Software. And so I have a section up the front where I put applicability to software genres up the front here. Where is it? And I'll tell you like the bullet points that I put on here: content management, digital asset management, marketing automation, content recommendation, email marketing, content analytics, and commerce and product marketing. I think those all kind of fit into kind of the same category. And I think there are some generalities we can make about software that exists in that space and projects that exist in that space. Is that content is a fairly subjective thing, and I think that a content management system is fundamentally different than a CRM, like a call center management system. I think a lot of the lessons in here are universal to software and professional services in general, but there's also some specificities around content, because content can be like magic and vague, right? We're going to do some magical marketing things, and some magic things are going to happen. Whereas, a system to manage the auto dialer in your call system, you can very much manage, you can very much evaluate the effectiveness of that by, uptime and handle time. And there are some very, very clear quantitative markers that you use to evaluate that, where content technology gets weirder. I mean, I talk in the book about, what if you run a company that does federal interstate paving? So you pave highways for the Federal Department of Transportation. Well, I mean, how do you put metrics on that? Because first of all, the number of your customers is very, very small. And second of all, like nobody Googles for who's going to pave 100 miles of federal interstate. Like nobody Googles for that. The value of SEO is kind of slim there. I mean, why do you have a website? I mean, you have a website because it would be weird not to have a website. And so like, how do you put metrics around that? How do you put goals and things around that? It just gets really fuzzy for some organizations. I remember I did a webinar where I talked about a company. I'll just say the name of the company. It was Mortensen Construction out of Minneapolis. They eventually went with Sitecore. I'm not sure who got it, but we competed for Episerver. And in talking with them, it was really interesting. They do massive construction projects. They built the Minnesota Vikings Stadium. They built a $100 million event center here in Sioux Falls. Well, you don't Google for that company. If you want an NFL stadium, you sort of know all the companies that will build NFL stadiums. It's kind of a backroom deal kind of situation. It's not, nobody puts an NFL stadium in their shopping cart and checks out. So how do you put like success metrics around that? And I think a lot of organizations just have a website because they can't not have a website. And that's the dirty little secret that maybe we don't talk about when it comes to content projects and CMS, is that sometimes we're kind of checking a box for our organization. I'm sorry, I'm getting very cynical here, but kind of that's where I was at on it.
No, you're absolutely right. You know, there are companies that, you know, they sell big things that you're not going to put in a shopping cart through e-commerce, right? And you're going to go and talk to a sales rep who's actually an engineer, and you know, you're going to do a handshake, and that's the way it will probably always be, because they're so customized or technical. And so, you know, in that case, what purpose does the website serve? And that's a tough question to ask sometimes, especially if you're in the marketing department at that company, right? So that's a tricky thing. And it's, you know, it comes down to like, you get so many people saying, well, what are the metrics we should look at? And I've had people ask me that, you know, what metrics should everyone be looking at? And I tell them, well, what are you trying to get out of your website? Why do you have one? That's your metrics. And they don't really get that. They just want to know like time on site or something. So,
yeah.
But it's definitely, it's not cynical. It's a reality. You know, some companies need a really big multi-million-dollar, you know, intense content-driven website, and some companies just need a few pages that tell you the phone number.
And if you're a restaurant, put the menu and the hours online, damn it.
Please give me the menu.
Give me the hours. Okay.
All right. So I guess the summary.
I'm at time, so I've got to drop.
So I think that's it. Is that 2 or 3 more chapters, perhaps?
Yeah. Okay. So we'll do like 7 more of these calls, and I'll have the second edition. Great job, everybody.
All right. Thanks for doing it. Let me stop the recording.
Thanks, everyone.